Ever been afraid of the dark? In the gospel lesson today, Jesus' disciples are caught in a boat on a stormy sea in the middle of the night in the dark. But they have this awesome encounter with Jesus. And just before Jesus comes and saves them and makes everything okay, he first of all scares them half to death. There may be much darkness in the world. And maybe even there's some darkness in your own life right now. But today we discover a Jesus who is Lord even of the darkness and more powerful than any storm raging in the world or even in our own lives for that matter. Hi, I'm Tim. And I want to welcome you to Hope Palm Springs. I have the privilege of being pastor developer of this new faith community in the desert, and I'm so glad that you're joining us for virtual worship. And I also want to thank those of you that took the time to respond to the survey that we recently put out. The information that you provided will certainly help us shape ministry in the midst of the storm that is a pandemic that leaves so much of the future uncertain. I guess you could say that we're doing ministry in the dark these days, but nonetheless, God calls us to be church now. And we are never alone as we are church. God is always with us, and we are with one another. So let me invite you to center your heart, your mind, your whole self on the presence of God's Spirit there with you and here with me. Maybe your life is full of light, and if that's so, then that's terrific. But perhaps you're sitting in the midst of a storm right now. Maybe you're even sitting in the darkness of that storm. If you are, I want you to be encouraged because Jesus is about to climb into your boat. Welcome to virtual worship. The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 14th chapter. Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Here ends the reading. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep and watch me through the night. Keep me safe till morning light. With these words, many children, including my own, were ushered into the darkness of night just before falling asleep. And for many of us, when we were children, a similar prayer provided the necessary bedtime ritual, helping us to feel safe and secure enough to relax, and eventually, after a glass of water and maybe one more trip to the bathroom, finally drift off. And still, we needed the hall light left on, dispelling just enough of the darkness to make us feel comfortable. Nyctophobia, or fear of the dark, at least to a certain degree, is a normal part of a child's development. As infants, we're fine with the dark, but by age 2 or 3, most of us have somehow become afraid of it. And maybe it's a fear we don't ever outgrow. At least that seems to be the case for the disciples in our gospel lesson. While they are rowing their boat to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, the winds pick up and the water becomes very rough. Not an unusual weather pattern for this particular geography, and not entirely an unusual situation either for seasoned fishermen. But in this case, the storm seems rather severe. The Greek word describing the waves is basanizo, which literally means torture. And the action of the wind is henantios, which means opposition. And so the boat is literally being tortured by the waves and opposed by the wind. Sometime early in the morning, according to the lesson, the disciples see Jesus walking on the water toward them. At first, they think him to be a ghost, and the text says they all cry out in fear. And why? Well, it's pretty obvious. I mean, in the center of the surrounding confusion of the storm, in the midst of the darkness of night, Jesus was not easily recognizable. And that is why darkness is a breeding ground for fear. When we're in the dark, we can't see anyone or anything clearly. We may feel panicky, helpless, isolated, vulnerable, lost, confused, and frightened. Darkness disorients and causes us to exaggerate and distort reality. For the disciples, the darkness made Jesus hard to see. So let me point out the obvious here. One could say, at least these days, that we're all pretty much in the same boat, huh? And the storm is raging around us. A pandemic, economic hardship, racial disparity, and the still tremendous amount of work that must be done to fight for an equality that 50 years after the civil rights movement still seems elusive. On top of that, there's tremendous anxiety over an upcoming election, and the days leading up to it are sure to be a three-ring circus. Of course, none of this even mentions the personal and individual issues that we all face in our lives. We're just like those disciples. We're in the midst of a storm, white-knuckling it, hanging on in the darkness. So perhaps we can relate. Well, back to our collective story then. The disciples see this shadowy figure of something coming to them on the water, and they're spooked. Now, a first century audience likely would have understood what we may miss, which is the utter terror of the waters, especially at night in the dark. Remember the creation story? God separates the water with a dome above and below the earth. But there was always this ever-present fear that broken boundaries could unleash chaotic waters. The story of Noah and the flood is a good example of that. That flood that destroyed an entire population, that was in their communal memory of the potential danger that water represents. Even in our modern understanding of the sea, we know of its potential to unleash tremendous chaos through something like a tsunami. So in ancient folklore, the sea represents chaos. It's unable to be restrained. The creatures that lived in these waters sometimes took on mythical dimensions, representing continuing danger that only a powerful deity could control. But in the midst of their terror, as this ominous figure is approaching them, in their minds some sort of monster perhaps, comes a familiar voice as Jesus shouts to them, "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." And then after an interesting experiment of faith with Simon Peter, Jesus eventually climbs into their boat. And as he does, we are told that the wind stops. The literal chaos is calmed, pointing us to Jesus' authority to speak over the abyss and restore order. Well, what did the disciples do next? It says they worshiped Jesus. When Jesus got into the boat, they worshiped him, and their worship was a direct response of their experience with Jesus in the dark. Now, as children, we learned to make friends with the darkness. We discovered nifty little things like flashlights and night lights. We decided the darkness was okay. We learned to tame our childlike minds with overactive imaginations that turned every shadow down the hallway into an approaching monster, or every bump in the night into some hideous beast lurking in our closet or beneath our bed. We may have outgrown our need for nightlights in order to feel safe enough to fall asleep, but have we ever really outgrown our fear of the dark? For life itself has its dark moments, times when we are confused or lost, or we can't see where we're going, situations that we just can't figure out, issues for us in our lives without clarity. And there is, of course, the darkness of despair, depression, or other emotions that chase away the light. Grief itself can be a darkness so overwhelming. And sorrow or sadness has often been referred to as the deep darkness of the soul. We may be much more sophisticated in our ways of dealing with the dark, but the truth is, when dark times come our way, we may still revert to our childhood, fearing the shadows on the walls that play tricks on our minds, or being irrationally certain that there is a monster in our situation waiting to devour us. And the crisis of faith is that when we walk through such dark times, when we walk through what Psalm 23 calls the valley of the shadow, when our boats are being tossed by the waves in the middle of the night, it is difficult to make out the figure of the one walking to us on the water. Sure, in the light of day, there's clarity, there's definition and understanding. Faith makes better sense, and God is easier to know. But in the dark and in our fear, we cry out, God, where are you? Jesus said to the disciples who thought he was a ghost, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. Jesus understood that we get scared of the dark. We learn in a gospel lesson that not only is Jesus the Lord of light and of the day, but he is also Lord of the darkness and of the night, and Lord of the chaos brooding and even unleashed. Is that really Jesus coming to us on the water, or is it a ghost? It's hard to tell. And yet, even in the dark, the disciples could finally see enough of him to know who he was. And maybe if we look carefully, our eyes of faith will finally adjust to the darkness too. And we will be able to see him, not in the fullness we'd like, but enough to know that it is Jesus who is coming to us. It is Jesus who is climbing into our boat. So maybe Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard was right when he said, faith sees best in the dark. Now, I'd love to assure you that with Jesus in the boat, that the storm will subside, but that's not always true. Sometimes the storm continues to rage, but so what? We are still in the presence of God, and I might add, also in the presence of others who are in the same boat with us. And while we may have to remain 6 feet apart for proper social distancing, it's still comforting to know that we are in good company. Chinese artist He Qi depicts a scene from this narrative in vibrant colors with characteristic echoes of Chinese folk art. The painting, Peace Be Still, portrays Jesus standing in the boat with his hand raised in a gesture of peace. Above his head is the dove with olive branch, reminiscent of the promise of diminishing flood waters in the story of Noah and the ark. The disciples are seated in the boat, facing Jesus with upturned faces in a horizontal line conveying a peaceful disposition. The chaotic waters swirl around the boat, but in the boat is tranquility. He points out that the horizontal lines through the disciples are at heart level. Their hearts are at peace, even in the midst of turbulent waters. In this painting, he captures the experience of the person of faith, that even in the midst of danger and fear, there is peace in the presence of Christ. And there is the promise that the turbulent waters will subside. Don't wait for the light of day to recognize the presence of God in your life. Know God is there in the dark, even if you can't quite make him out. And though at times you may be scared of the dark, may the prayer of the child become the prayer of the grown-up. Keep and watch me through the night. Keep me safe till morning light.